The trail camera captured it at 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, 2008. Four figures hiking into the dense wilderness of the Cascade Range, their bright jackets a splash of color against the darkening forest. The Morrison family, David, Rachel, and their two children, Emma and Lucas, smiling, waving at the camera as they passed. That was the last confirmed sighting. 16 years later, a routine trail maintenance crew discovered something that would turn this cold case into one of the most disturbing mysteries in Pacific Northwest history. What they found wasn't just remains. It was a camp, a functioning camp, and inside the largest tent, a journal with entries dated just 3 months ago. This is the story of the family that walked into the mountain, and the truth that emerged from the darkness they left behind. If you're drawn to true crime mysteries that delve into the darkest corners of human psychology, subscribe now. The October wind carried the scent of pine and approaching rain as Sarah Chen adjusted her work gloves and surveyed the overgrown section of the Cascade Ridge Trail. As the regional trail coordinator for Washington State Parks, she had seen her share of abandoned campsites and forgotten gear over 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for what lay beyond the collapsed Douglas fir that blocked the narrow path. Her crew had been clearing deadfall for 3 hours when Marcus, her youngest team member, called out from deeper in the woods. His voice carried a strange quality, something between confusion and unease. Sarah made her way through the undergrowth, her boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. The camp emerged from the forest, like a secret the mountain had been keeping. 3 tents arranged in a precise triangle, their fabric weathered but intact. A stone fire pit with charred wood, supplies stored in bear-proof containers, and everywhere, strange arrangements of stones and sticks, patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Marcus stood frozen at the entrance to the largest tent, his face pale. Sarah approached slowly, pulling back the tent flap. The smell hit her first, must and decay and something else, something organic that made her stomach turn. Inside, the tent was organized with an eerie precision. Sleeping bags arranged side by side, a small pile of clothes folded neatly in one corner, and on a flat rock, serving as a makeshift table, a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with moisture but still legible. Sarah pulled on latex gloves from her first aid kit and carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was small, cramped, growing increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, but it was the date on the final entry that made her breath catch in her throat. June 17th, 2024. Less than 4 months ago. Her hands trembled as she reached for her radio, because Sarah Chen recognized this campsite. She had been part of the original search and rescue team 16 years earlier, one of dozens who had combed these mountains for weeks, finding nothing. The Morrison family had become a cautionary tale, a tragedy that reminded hikers of how quickly the wilderness could swallow people whole. But if this journal was real, if that date was accurate, then the Morrisons hadn't died in 2008. They had been here in these woods all along, and someone had been alive just months ago, writing entries that Sarah's trembling fingers were now reading, entries that began with reasonable explanations and evolved into something she couldn't quite comprehend, something that made the forest around her feel suddenly alive and watching. She keyed her radio with shaking hands. The investigation that followed would uncover secrets that challenged everything anyone thought they knew about survival, family, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is true. Detective James Holbrook had been with the King County Sheriff's Office for 23 years, long enough to develop a sixth sense about cases that would haunt him. When the call came through about the Morrison campsite discovery, that familiar cold weight settled in his chest before he even heard the details. He stood now in the incident command tent at the Cascade Ridge trailhead, studying the photographs spread across the folding table. Sarah Chen sat across from him, her thermos of coffee untouched, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept since making the discovery 2 days earlier. "Walk me through it again," James said, his voice gentle despite his rising unease. "Everything you saw, before you touched anything." Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of one photograph. The camp was approximately 2 miles off the maintained trail, in a depression between 2 ridges. The tents were in good condition considering. Military grade, designed for extreme weather. The main tent, the family tent, that's where we found the journal. She pulled out a clear evidence bag containing the leather journal. Even through the plastic, James could see the water damage, the warped pages, the desperate scrawl of handwriting that seemed to press deeper into the paper as the entries progressed. "The forensics team has been documenting everything," Sarah continued. "What, detective? There's something else. Something I didn't put in my initial report because I thought I might be seeing things." James looked up sharply. "What?" Sarah pulled out her phone, swiping to a photo she had taken before the official investigation began. It showed one of the stone arrangements, this one more elaborate than the others. Rocks had been carefully stacked in a spiral pattern, and at its center, small bones were arranged in a shape James couldn't quite identify. "There are 17 of these around the camp," Sarah said quietly. "Each one different, but all of them intentional, deliberate. And, detective, those bones, some of them are human. Small ones. Finger bones, we think." The silence in the tent stretched thin. Outside, James could hear the activity of the crime scene team, the distant thrum of a helicopter bringing in additional equipment. The Morrison case had been cold for 16 years, filed away with hundreds of other missing person cases that went nowhere. David Morrison, 42, experienced hiker and geography teacher. Rachel Morrison, 39, emergency room nurse. Emma Morrison, 14, honors student with a passion for photography. Lucas Morrison, 9, the boy who collected rocks and insisted on identifying every geological formation they passed. They had planned a week-long trek through the Cascades, a family tradition they observed every October. They had permits, proper equipment, emergency beacons. They had checked in at every ranger station along their route until October 15th, when they left Cascade Ridge and headed into the backcountry. After that, nothing. The emergency beacons went dark. The family vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed them. The search had been extensive. Helicopters, dog teams, hundreds of volunteers combing the mountains for 3 weeks before the first snows made it impossible to continue. The prevailing theory had been a fall, an accident, bodies carried off by animals or buried under rockfall. Tragic, but understandable. The mountains were unforgiving. But this changed everything. "The journal," James said, pulling his attention back to the present. "Has anyone read through it completely?" "Dr. Lisa Winters, the forensic psychologist," Sarah replied. "She's been going through it for the past 30 hours. She asked to speak with you specifically. Said it was urgent." James found Dr. Winters in the mobile forensics lab, a converted RV parked at the edge of the command area. She was younger than he expected, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun, and glasses that magnified her tired eyes. The journal lay open on the table before her, protected now by a clear acrylic cover. "Detective Holbrook," she said, not offering her hand. "Thank you for coming. I'm not sure what to make of this." She gestured to the journal. "I've documented over 300 entries spanning from October 2008 to this past June. The handwriting belongs to at least 3 different people. David Morrison's entries are the most frequent in the early years. Rachel's become more dominant after, based on my analysis, sometime in 2012. And there's a third hand, smaller, more careful, that appears starting in 2015. One of the children, James said. Emma, Dr. Winters confirmed, based on the content and vocabulary. Lucas would have been, let me calculate, 25 in 2024. But there are no entries that match what we'd expect from an adult male. Just David, Rachel, and Emma. The implication hung in the air between them. James felt his jaw tighten. Lucas didn't make it. That's what the journal suggests, though it's never stated explicitly. The entries are, Detective, they're disturbing. They start normally enough. The family encountered a storm on their second day, sought shelter in the same depression where we found the camp. David's entries talk about waiting out the weather, about the trail being washed out by mudslides, rational decisions. But then, something shifts. Dr. Winters carefully turned pages, each protected by a thin sheet of archival paper. Around day 10, David's handwriting changes, becomes more erratic. He writes about hearing things in the woods, about Rachel insisting they stay put, about Emma and Lucas getting sick. By day 20, he's writing about markers, about making sure they can find their way back, about the trees moving when he isn't looking. She looked up at James, her expression troubled. By November, 1 month in, David Morrison was experiencing severe psychological breakdown, paranoid ideation, possible hallucinations, and Detective, no one attempted to leave. In 16 years, with breaks in weather, with opportunities, they stayed in that camp. James leaned forward, studying the cramped handwriting. The entries were dated, meticulous as in their timekeeping, despite their increasingly disturbing content. He read one entry from December 2008, David's hand. We can't leave. Rachel explained it again today. The mountain requires us to stay. Lucas saw it too, in the stone patterns. Emma's fever broke, thank God. But she speaks differently now. Says she understands the whispers in the trees. I want to argue, want to insist we push for civilization. But every time I face the trail, my legs won't move. The fear is physical, crushing. We stay. There's more, Dr. Winters said, her voice dropping lower. The entries from Rachel, starting in what appears to be 2010, describe a very different reality. She writes about others in the woods, about the collective, about ceremonies and offerings. She claims they're not alone, that they're part of something larger now. James looked at the photographs again, at the stone spirals and the carefully arranged bones. You're saying she developed some kind of shared psychosis? Folie à plusieurs, Dr. Winters confirmed. Shared delusional disorder. It typically occurs in isolated groups, family units especially. One member develops psychosis, and the others, trapped with them, begin to adopt the same delusional framework. The isolation, the stress, the lack of outside reality checks, it all contributes. The Morrison family, trapped by weather and fear, and increasingly unstable psychology, created their own reality out there. But the journal entries continue for 16 years, James said. How did they survive? That's what we need to find out. The camp had supplies, yes, but not enough for 16 years. They had to be supplementing somehow, hunting, foraging. The forest is harsh but not impossible. And Detective, there's something else you need to see. Dr. Winters pulled out another evidence bag, this one containing a smaller notebook, the kind a child might use for school. The cover was decorated with stickers of flowers and stars, now faded and peeling. This is Emma's diary, Dr. Winters said. We found it in a separate container, wrapped in plastic for preservation. Her entries, they provide context to her parents' writings. She knew, Detective. Emma Morrison knew that her parents were deteriorating mentally. She knew that what they believed about the forest, about the reasons they couldn't leave, wasn't real. And yet she stayed. For 16 years, even into adulthood, she remained with them. The Morrison family home in Bellingham sat exactly as it had for 16 years, preserved by David's brother Thomas Morrison, like a museum to the missing. James and his partner, Detective Sarah Reeves, stood on the front porch as Thomas fumbled with keys, his hands shaking visibly. "I kept hoping," Thomas said, pushing open the door to release a breath of stale air. "Every year, I thought maybe this would be the year they'd walk back through that door." 16 Octobers came and went. The interior was trapped in 2008. Emma's volleyball trophy still sat on the mantel. Lucas's science fair project, a model of the water cycle, occupied space on the bookshelf. Photographs covered every surface, capturing the Morrison family in happier times. James studied one, David and Rachel on their wedding day, young and impossibly optimistic. "Tell me about David's state of mind before the trip," James said, settling into an armchair while Sarah photographed the room. Thomas lowered himself onto the couch, seeming to age 10 years in the motion. He was stable. Good job, good marriage, beautiful kids. The only thing that was different that year was the medication. James's attention sharpened. "Medication?" "For depression," Thomas explained. "David had struggled with it on and off since college, but it got worse after our parents died in 2007. He'd been on antidepressants for about 6 months before the trip. Seemed to be doing well, honestly. Better than he'd been in years." Sarah looked up from her camera. "Do you remember which medication?" "Something new his doctor prescribed. I don't remember the name." Thomas rubbed his face. He'd been through several that didn't work. This one seemed to help. James made a note to pull David's medical records. Certain antidepressants could cause severe reactions if stopped abruptly, could trigger psychotic episodes in susceptible individuals if David had forgotten his medication or run out on the mountain if withdrawal had set in during that first storm. "What about Rachel?" James asked. "Any history of mental health issues?" Thomas shook his head. "Rachel was rock solid, had to be, working in the ER. She saw terrible things daily and never let it shake her. But she was devoted to David, almost obsessively so. When he struggled, she structured her entire life around supporting him. Some of us worried it wasn't healthy. How much of herself she sacrificed for his stability." Sarah wandered to the hallway, studying the family photographs that lined the walls. "They look happy here?" "They were," Thomas said. "David loved those kids more than anything. Emma was his pride, so smart, so driven. And Lucas was his shadow. That boy worshipped his father. That's why this makes no sense, Detective. David would have moved heaven and earth to get his children to safety. If they were trapped by weather, if there was any way out, he would have found it. Unless he couldn't, James thought. Unless his mind had fractured so completely that he no longer recognized the path to safety, saw threats where none existed, convinced his family that remaining in the wilderness was their only option. "Did David ever talk about paranoia?" James asked. "Fear of people, institutions, government?" Thomas considered this carefully. Not paranoia exactly. But David had strong feelings about self-reliance, about modern society being too disconnected from nature. He took the kids camping constantly, taught them survival skills, how to identify edible plants, build shelters. He called it preparedness. Rachel sometimes joked he was training them for the apocalypse. James and Sarah exchanged glances. The pieces were assembling into a troubling picture. A man with untreated or improperly treated depression, predisposed to self-reliant thinking, trapped in the wilderness with his family during a period of extreme stress. The perfect conditions for psychological breakdown. They spent another hour in the house, documenting everything, looking for clues to the family's mental state before the trip. In Emma's room, Sarah found the girls' journal, entries from the weeks before they left. James read through them carefully. October 3rd, 2008. Dad seems different lately. Mom says the new medicine is helping, but I don't know. He keeps talking about the trip, like it's the most important thing we'll ever do. Like we're going to see something profound. Lucas doesn't notice, but I do. Dad's eyes look strange sometimes, like he's listening to something the rest of us can't hear. October 10th, 2008. 5 more days until the trek. Dad made us pack and repack our supplies 3 times. He's obsessed with making sure we have everything we could possibly need. Mom told him we're only going for a week, but Dad said, "You never know when a week becomes longer. The mountain has its own timeline." I asked what he meant, but he just smiled and said I'd understand soon. The entries sent chills down James's spine. David Morrison had been deteriorating before they ever reached the mountain. The wilderness hadn't broken him. It had simply provided the environment for his fracturing mind to reconstruct reality into something his family couldn't escape. "We need to find Rachel and Emma," James said, closing the journal. "The remains at the camp, they're still being analyzed. But preliminary reports suggest at least 2 bodies, if they survived until recently." Thomas looked up sharply, hope and horror warring on his face. "You think they might still be alive? After 16 years? "The journal entries continue until June," Sarah said gently. "Someone was alive 4 months ago. Someone was writing, thinking, documenting. We need to expand the search radius. Check every canyon, every cave, every possible shelter within a 10-mile radius of that camp." James's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. The text was from Dr. Winters. "Preliminary DNA results from camp remains. You need to see this immediately. It's not what we thought." He stood abruptly. "Thomas, thank you for your time. We'll be in touch soon." In the car, Sarah drove, while James pulled up the report Dr. Winters had sent. His eyes scanned the preliminary findings once, then twice, his mind refusing to accept what he was reading. The remains found at the camp belonged to David Morrison. The dental records confirmed it. But the bones showed signs of perimortem trauma, fractures consistent with a fall, dating to approximately 2009 or 2010. David Morrison had been dead for over 14 years, which meant that every journal entry attributed to David, after that point, every note about his deteriorating mental state, every description of his paranoid behavior, had been written by someone else. Someone had been documenting David's perspective, inhabiting his voice, long after he was dead. "Sarah," James said quietly, "we're not dealing with a tragedy. We're dealing with something much worse." The implications crashed over him like a wave. Rachel Morrison and her daughter Emma had spent over a decade living with David's corpse, pretending he was still alive, writing journal entries in his voice, maintaining the fiction of his presence. What kind of psychological break caused that? What kind of reality had they constructed in those woods that required David to remain alive, even in death? And somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, if the timeline was correct, Rachel or Emma or both might still be out there, living in whatever fractured world they had built, from madness and isolation, and the desperate need to believe their family remained whole. The search was about to get significantly more disturbing. The forensic anthropology tent was lit by harsh LED lamps when James arrived at midnight. Dr. Patricia Greenwood, her silver hair tucked under a surgical cap, looked up from the examination table, where David Morrison's remains lay arranged in anatomical order. "Detective," she said, her voice carrying the weight of too many hours without sleep. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I've been examining these bones for the past 6 hours, and I need to show you something that changes our timeline considerably." James approached the table, forcing himself to view the remains clinically. David Morrison's skeleton was incomplete, missing several ribs and the lower left leg, but enough remained to tell a story. Dr. Greenwood pointed to the skull, specifically to a depressed fracture on the right parietal bone. This injury was perimortem, occurring at or near the time of death. The fracture pattern is consistent with a fall onto rock, probably from a significant height, 10 feet or more. "But detective, look at this." She indicated several of the long bones, femur and humerus, which showed unusual markings. "These are cut marks, made with a metal blade, probably a hunting knife. They're post-mortem, occurring weeks or possibly months after death." James felt his throat constrict. Someone was butchering the body. "Defleshing it," Dr. Greenwood corrected clinically. "The marks are methodical, precise, not frenzied or emotional. Someone with anatomical knowledge performed this, removed the tissue deliberately. Based on the weathering of the bone and the lack of certain elements we'd expect to find, I'd estimate this was done within 6 months of death, probably less." The tent suddenly felt suffocating. James thought of Rachel Morrison, emergency room nurse, someone with extensive anatomical knowledge. He thought of Emma, 14 years old at the time, watching her mother systematically strip flesh from her father's corpse. "There's more," Dr. Greenwood said, moving to a separate evidence table. "These are the finger bones Sarah Chen photographed in the stone arrangements. We've identified them as belonging to at least 3 different individuals. 1 adult male, David Morrison, and 2 juveniles, both under the age of 12. The world tilted. "Lucas." "We believe so, though we'll need to confirm with DNA. But detective, there's a 3rd child, someone younger than Lucas, probably between 6 and 8 years old. The bones show similar cut marks, similar post-mortem processing, and based on the degree of weathering, this child died more recently, possibly within the last 5 to 7 years. James's mind raced through the implications. There was another child out there, someone who died after the Morrisons disappeared. Or someone who was already there, Dr. Greenwood suggested quietly. The journal mentions the collective, other people in the woods. What if the Morrisons encountered someone else, another family or group living off-grid? What if Emma or Lucas had a child? The horror of that possibility settled like ice in James's chest. Emma Morrison had been 14 when her family disappeared. She would have been in her teens during those years in the wilderness. If David before his death, or if there had been others. He couldn't finish the thought. Dr. Greenwood's assistant entered the tent, carrying a sealed evidence bag. "Dr. Greenwood, you need to see this." The team just found it in a shallow grave, about 50 yards from the main camp. Inside the bag was a small backpack, child-sized, decorated with cartoon characters that James didn't recognize. The fabric was deteriorated, but still intact. The assistant carefully opened it, revealing its contents. A change of clothes, size 6T. A stuffed rabbit, its fur matted with dirt, and a birth certificate sealed in plastic, dated March 15, 2017. The name on the certificate read, Sarah Morrison. Parents listed as Emma Morrison and unknown. James felt the case shift beneath him like unstable ground. Emma had been pregnant at 17, had given birth in the wilderness at 23, and that child had died before reaching 8 years old. 3 generations of Morrisons had lived and died in those woods, creating their own isolated world that operated on rules James couldn't begin to understand. "We need to find Rachel and Emma," he said, his voice rough. "Right now. Expand the search to a 20-mile radius. Bring in thermal imaging, more helicopters, every resource we have." Because somewhere in those mountains, the survivors of the Morrison family were still living, according to the fractured logic that had kept them isolated for 16 years. And if they were following the pattern established by the journal, if they were still performing whatever rituals those stone arrangements represented, then time was critically short. The mountain had taken David, had taken Lucas, had taken Emma's daughter. The question that haunted James as he left the tent was simple and terrible. How many more would it claim before this ended? The search teams deployed at dawn, fanning out from the campsite in expanding circles. James joined the ground team led by Sarah Chen, following trails that barely existed, pushing through dense underbrush that suggested no human had passed this way in years. But the journal had been clear in its later entries. Rachel and Emma had ranging patterns, territories they moved through, places they considered sacred or safe or necessary to their survival. By midday, the thermal imaging helicopter reported a heat signature 3 miles northeast of the original camp, tucked into a rock formation that created a natural shelter. James's team reached it an hour later, scrambling up a steep incline that left them breathless and scraped. The shelter was more elaborate than the camp. Someone had constructed walls from branches and mud, created a door from salvaged tarp, built a chimney system that vented smoke through a crack in the rock. It was, James realized with disturbing clarity, a home. Someone had been living here not for weeks or months, but for years, improving and expanding, settling in with the permanence of someone who never intended to leave. Sarah pulled back the tarp door, her flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. The smell hit them immediately. Organic decay and unwashed human, and something else, something chemical that James couldn't identify. The shelter was empty of people, but full of evidence of habitation. Sleeping areas, carefully organized supplies, and covering every available surface. Drawings. James stepped inside carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The drawings were obsessive, repetitive, covering the rock walls and wooden supports in layers upon layers, stone patterns identical to those found at the camp. Human figures in various poses, some recognizable as the Morrison family, others abstract and distorted. And everywhere, a symbol James didn't recognize, a spiral within a circle, with radiating lines like a dark sun. "Detective," Sarah called from deeper in the shelter. "There's another room." The second chamber was smaller, accessed through a low opening that required crawling. James pulled himself through and stood, his flashlight revealing what could only be described as a shrine. More symbols covered the walls, but here they were painted in what appeared to be blood, dried to brown, but still visible. In the center of the space, a flat rock served as an altar, and on it, arranged with ceremonial precision, were bones, small bones, finger bones, teeth, and a skull, child-sized, placed at the altar's center like an offering or a deity. James felt bile rise in his throat. This wasn't just survival. This wasn't just psychological breakdown. The Morrison women had created an entire belief system, a religion built from isolation and madness and the need to make meaning from unimaginable loss. Sarah's voice came from the first chamber, tight with urgency. "James, I found something. A calendar. He crawled back through, finding Sarah crouched beside a flat section of rock, where someone had carved lines, grouping them in sets of 7. Days, weeks, years. The carvings covered the entire surface, thousands of marks, and at the end, written in what looked like charcoal, a date: October 15th, 2024, yesterday. They were here yesterday, Sarah said, her hand unconsciously moving to her service weapon. They knew we found the camp. They're running. James pulled out his radio, calling for additional units, for the helicopter to focus search patterns on escape routes leading away from this location. Because Rachel and Emma Morrison weren't waiting to be rescued. They were fleeing, protecting whatever secret world they had built, refusing to let civilization drag them back from the reality they had chosen. The radio crackled with response, units repositioning, the search intensifying. But as James emerged from the shelter into the afternoon light, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The Morrison women had survived 16 years in these mountains. They knew every canyon, every trail, every place to hide. They had become part of the wilderness in a way that made them nearly impossible to find, unless they wanted to be found. The command center buzzed with activity as night fell over the Cascades. James stood before a wall, covered in maps, photographs, and timeline charts, trying to piece together the psychological journey that had transformed the Morrison family from lost hikers to something he didn't have words for. Dr. Winters entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thick folder. She handed James a cup and settled into the chair beside him, her expression troubled. "I've been analyzing Emma's diary alongside the main journal," she said, opening the folder to reveal photocopied pages covered in a young woman's handwriting. The entries paint a picture of someone who understood what was happening to her family, but felt powerless to stop it. She pulled out a specific page, dated March 2009. Emma writes here about Lucas getting sick with what she thinks is pneumonia. She begs her mother to leave, to get him to a hospital. Rachel refuses, says the mountain won't let them go, that leaving would anger something she calls the presence. Emma tries to convince her father to overrule Rachel. But David, this is important, David doesn't respond. Emma writes, "Dad hasn't spoken in 3 days. He just sits by the fire and stares at the trees. I don't think he's really here anymore." James felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. David was already gone by then, mentally if not physically. "I believe so," Dr. Winters confirmed. The fall that killed him likely occurred sometime in late February or early March 2009. Emma's entries around that time become chaotic, emotional. She describes hearing a scream, her mother running into the woods, being left alone with Lucas for hours. When Rachel returns, she tells Emma that David is with the mountain now, but that he'll always be with them. I think that's when Rachel began writing in David's voice in the main journal. Dr. Winters turned to another section, her voice dropping lower. "And Lucas?" From Emma's diary. Lucas died in April 2009. The pneumonia. Emma describes holding him, feeling him struggle to breathe, watching the light leave his eyes, while Rachel performed what she calls the ceremony of joining. Rachel told Emma that Lucas wasn't dead, that he had merged with the presence, that they would see him in the patterns if they looked carefully. The horror of it settled over James like a physical weight. 2 children dead, within weeks of each other. And Rachel Morrison's response had been to construct an elaborate delusion that kept them alive in spirit, that transformed their deaths into something mystical, rather than the tragic result of her refusal to seek help. "Emma stayed," James said, the words barely above a whisper. "For 15 more years, knowing her father and brother were dead. She stayed with her mother. She was 14. Dr. Winters reminded him gently. Traumatized, isolated, completely dependent on the only parent she had left. Rachel wasn't just her mother anymore. She was the sole source of food, shelter, protection, and most importantly, the keeper of the belief system that gave meaning to all the death surrounding them. To reject Rachel would have been to accept that her father and brother died for nothing, that their suffering was meaningless. The delusion, detective, was easier than the truth. James thought about the birth certificate they'd found, about baby Sarah, born in the wilderness, to a mother who had been little more than a child herself. Who was the father? Dr. Winters's expression darkened. That's what I've been trying to determine. Emma's diary entries from 2015 and 2016, when she would have been 21 and 22, mention someone called the Walker. She describes him as someone who moves through the woods, who visits their camp, who Rachel welcomes as part of the collective. The entries suggest this person was male, older, and that Rachel encouraged Emma to join with him. Jesus Christ, James breathed. There was someone else out there. Someone who knew the Morrisons were in the woods and did nothing. Someone who... He couldn't finish the sentence. We need to identify this person, Dr. Winters said firmly. If there's someone else living in these mountains, someone who's been in contact with the Morrisons, they might know where Rachel and Emma went. They might even be helping them hide. James's phone rang, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. Sarah's voice came through tight with adrenaline. James, we found something. A fresh camp, still warm embers in the fire pit. And there's a note. It's addressed to you. 20 minutes later, James stood at the hastily abandoned campsite, staring at a piece of paper weighted down with stones. The handwriting was neat, controlled, utterly calm. Detective Holbrook, you're looking for us, but you don't understand what you're looking for. We're not lost. We're not prisoners. We chose this. The mountain chose us. David understood first. Lucas followed. My daughter Sarah joined them willingly. Soon there will be others. The world you come from is the prison. We're free. Stop looking. You won't find us unless we want you to. And if we want you to find us, detective, it will be because you're meant to stay. R.M. James read the note 3 times, each reading making his blood run colder. Rachel Morrison wasn't running from rescue. She was playing a game, leading them deeper into the wilderness, testing whether they were worthy of whatever truth she believed she'd discovered in these woods. Sarah approached with an evidence bag. We found tracks leading northwest, toward the high country. But James, the tracks? There are at least 3 sets. Rachel, Emma, and someone else. Someone with large feet. Adult male, probably. The Walker might not be a delusion. James looked up at the darkening sky, at the mountains that rose like silent sentinels around them. The Morrison case had evolved from a missing persons investigation to something far more complex and dangerous. They were hunting people who didn't want to be found, who had built an entire reality in the wilderness, who believed they were following some higher purpose that James couldn't begin to comprehend. And somewhere in those mountains, possibly right now, Rachel Morrison was watching the search teams, studying them, deciding which of them might be converted to her way of thinking, and which were simply obstacles to be avoided or eliminated. The note had been a message and a warning. The game had begun, and James had the sinking feeling that he and his team were already several moves behind. Get thermal imaging focused on the high country, he ordered, his voice harder than he intended. And someone pull records for anyone reported missing in this area over the past 15 years. If there's a Walker, if there are others living off-grid out here, we need to know who they are and what they want. Because the Morrison family had stopped being victims, the moment they decided to stay. Now they were something else entirely, something that had learned to survive in the darkness, something that had made peace with loss by transforming it into belief. And belief, James knew from too many years in law enforcement, could make people capable of absolutely anything. The search continued into the night, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out below, indifferent to the secrets the mountain kept in its deepest shadows. The archived missing persons files arrived at the command center at 0400 hours, delivered by a pale-faced clerk from the Seattle office who looked relieved to hand them over and leave. James spread 13 folders across the table, each one representing someone who had vanished in the Cascade Range over the past 2 decades. Most were standard cases, solo hikers who'd gotten lost, bodies eventually recovered. An elderly man with dementia who'd wandered from a campground. But 3 files made James's hands still on the papers. Michael Brennan, age 37, reported missing in October 2011. Experienced survivalist who'd gone into the mountains for a solo trek and never returned. His truck had been found at a trailhead 12 miles from where the Morrison camp was discovered. The search had lasted 2 weeks before being called off. Jennifer Hayworth, age 29, disappeared in August 2015 with her 6-year-old son, Nathan. She'd been camping with her husband when she and the boy vanished during the night. The husband claimed they'd had an argument, that Jennifer had stormed off with Nathan and never came back. He'd passed a polygraph. The case remained open, unsolved. And most disturbing, Thomas Whitfield, age 42, reported missing in March 2019. Park ranger with 20 years experience. He'd been conducting a solo trail inspection and failed to report in. His equipment was eventually found scattered across a half-mile radius, as if deliberately abandoned. No body, no explanation. Dr. Winters entered the tent, her tablet glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. I've been cross-referencing Emma's diary entries with the dates these people disappeared. Detective, Emma writes about visitors, about people Rachel called seekers, who came to learn from them, to understand the mountain's truth. She describes at least 4 different individuals between 2010 and 2020. James felt ice forming in his chest. The Morrisons weren't alone out there. They were recruiting. Or eliminating, Dr. Winters said quietly. She pulled up a scanned diary page on her tablet. Emma's entry from August 2015. She writes, "Mother brought the new ones today. A woman with a child. The woman cried and begged to leave. Mother said she wasn't ready, that the mountain had tested her and found her wanting. The walker took them to the deep place. I didn't see them again." The deep place. James thought about the terrain maps spread across the command table, about the canyons and caves and crevasses that riddled these mountains, places where bodies might never be found. Jennifer Hayworth and her son, he said, pulling their file forward. August 2015. They didn't wander off. Someone took them. Michael Brennan fits the profile too, Dr. Winters continued. Emma writes about the bearded seeker. In late 2011, describes him as eager, willing, someone Rachel thought might truly understand. But then the entries stopped mentioning him, just a single line in December. The bearded one couldn't complete the transformation. He rests with the others now. James's radio crackled to life. Sarah's voice came through, tense and breathless. "James, we've got something at the high country search grid. You need to see this now." The helicopter ride to the high country took 15 minutes, the rising sun painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. They sat down in a small clearing, where Sarah's team had established a perimeter around a discovery that made James's blood run cold. The cave entrance was partially concealed by brush, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the thermal imaging had detected multiple heat signatures, but by the time the team arrived, whatever had generated that heat had moved deeper into the cave system. James ducked through the entrance, his headlamp cutting through absolute darkness. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and what his light revealed made him stop breathing. Bodies, not skeletons, not old remains, but preserved corpses, frozen by the cave's perpetual cold. They were arranged in a circle, seated upright, their hands positioned as if in prayer or meditation. James counted 6 bodies, their clothes and tissue mummified by the dry, cold environment. "Don't touch anything," he ordered, though his team was already maintaining careful distance. "Get forensics up here immediately." Sarah moved her light across the bodies, stopping on one wearing a park ranger uniform, the name tag still visible, T. Whitfield. "Oh, God, James, that's Thomas Whitfield. He's been missing for 5 years." The other bodies ranged in age and condition. An older man with a thick beard, probably Michael Brennan. A younger woman positioned protectively around a small form. James forced himself to look at the child's face, frozen in an expression that wasn't quite peaceful, wasn't quite anguished. Jennifer and Nathan Hayworth. "This isn't a burial site," Dr. Winters said, her professional detachment cracking slightly. "This is a display, a temple." They are arranged in ritual positions, facing inward toward the center of the circle. James directed his light to the circle's center, a flat stone altar, similar to the one found in Rachel's shelter, but larger, more elaborate. Symbols covered its surface, the dark spiral sun, repeated over and over. And lying on the altar, small enough that James had initially missed it, a leather collar. Sarah picked it up carefully with gloved hands. Inside the collar, burned into the leather, a name. Sarah. Emma's daughter. The child who died sometime in the past 7 years. They'd been looking for remains, for a grave. But perhaps that wasn't how it had worked. Perhaps Sarah's death had been different. Ritualized, her body claimed by whatever dark ceremony the Morrison women had created. "They're here," Sarah said suddenly, her voice sharp. "The heat signatures, they're not gone. They're deeper in the cave system." James pulled his weapon, the weight familiar and comforting in his hand. "Sarah, radio for backup. Dr. Winters, get outside and wait for the forensics team. Nobody goes deeper without tactical support." But even as he gave the orders, James knew they were already committed. The Morrison women had led them here deliberately, had left a trail of breadcrumbs designed to bring them to this exact point. This was the revelation Rachel wanted them to see, the proof that her belief system was real, that people had willingly joined her or been judged unworthy and left to freeze in eternal meditation. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Not words, but singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, performing a melody that James didn't recognize. Something that felt ancient and wrong. A song that made his skin crawl and his rational mind scream warnings about danger, about madness, about crossing into territory from which there might be no return. The backup teams would take at least 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes. While Rachel or Emma or both performed whatever ritual this place was designed for. 20 minutes, while evidence potentially disappeared into the endless dark of the cave system. James made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. We go in. Carefully, weapons ready. But we go in now. Sarah, you're with me. Everyone else, secure this chamber and await backup. They moved deeper into darkness, following the singing voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, following it down into the mountain's throat, into the place where the Morrison family's delusions had taken root and grown into something that consumed everyone who encountered it. The temperature dropped with each step. The walls narrowed, pressing close, and ahead, somewhere in the black, the singing continued, pulling them forward like a siren's call, like a promise or a threat or both. The cave tunnel opened into a vast chamber where James's headlamp couldn't find the far walls. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen fangs, and in the center of the space, lit by what appeared to be dozens of candles, a figure stood with her back to them. She wore layers of animal skins and tattered fabric, her long gray hair hanging past her waist. She continued singing, her voice echoing off the stone walls, creating harmonics that seemed impossible from a single human throat. "Rachel Morrison," James called out, his weapon trained on her center mass. "I'm Detective James Holbrook, with the King County Sheriff's Office. I need you to turn around slowly and show me your hands." The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, James could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, the sound of his own breathing, Sarah's presence behind him. Then Rachel Morrison turned, and James had to fight to keep his expression neutral. She looked far older than her 55 years. Her face was gaunt, weathered by exposure, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made James's finger twitch on the trigger. This wasn't the vacant stare of someone broken by trauma. This was focus, purpose, absolute conviction. "Detective Holbrook," Rachel said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You found our temple. You saw the ones who couldn't complete the journey. I knew you would. The mountain shows its truth to those who are ready to see." "Where is Emma?" James demanded. "Where is your daughter?" Rachel smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Emma is exactly where she needs to be, where she's always been, part of something larger than herself, larger than the small, frightened world you come from." Sarah moved to James's right, creating a crossfire position. "Mrs. Morrison, you need medical attention. Let us help you. Let us take you somewhere safe." "Safe?" Rachel laughed, the sound bouncing off stone. "I've been safe for 16 years, safer than I ever was in civilization, with its poisons and lies and desperate grasping. My husband understood. My son joined willingly. My granddaughter ascended to become one with the presence. And Emma." Her expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Emma is becoming what she was always meant to be." James kept his weapon steady, but his mind raced through tactical options. Rachel was unarmed as far as he could see, but the cave system was vast, full of shadows and places for ambush. Emma could be anywhere, armed, watching. "Tell me about David," James said, trying to keep her talking, buying time for backup to arrive. "Tell me what happened in March 2009. Rachel's eyes took on a distant quality, but she remained dangerously alert. David was the first to truly see. The mountain spoke to him during that first storm, showed him what we could become if we shed the false self that civilization had imposed. He tried to ascend too quickly, tried to fly before he understood flight. The mountain caught him, kept him, transformed him from flesh to guidance. He fell," James said flatly. "He hit his head on a rock and died. Then you stripped his body and arranged his bones in your rituals. That's not transcendence. That's desecration. You use words from your world, detective, but they have no meaning here." David's essence joined with the mountain. His physical form became sacred, a bridge between what we were and what we're becoming. Every bone placed with intention, every arrangement is a prayer, a map, a promise. Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. "And Lucas, Your 9-year-old son who died of pneumonia because you refused to get him medical help? What spiritual meaning did his suffering serve? For the first time, something flickered in Rachel's expression. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the person she'd been before the mountain claimed her. Lucas was pure. He didn't need the long transformation. He simply opened himself and merged. I held him as he ascended. I felt his spirit rise. He's in the stones now, in the patterns, in the bones we arrange to honor those who've joined the collective. You're describing psychotic breaks, James said, his voice harder. Delusions built from grief and isolation. Your husband and son died, Mrs. Morrison. Your granddaughter died. And you convinced Emma to stay in this hell because facing the truth was too painful. Rachel's expression shifted, became something colder, more dangerous. You think you're rescuing her. You think you're the hero of this story. But Emma doesn't want to be rescued, Detective. She's known both worlds, chosen this one, and she's waiting. The words landed like a physical blow. Before James could respond, his headlamp flickered and died. Sarah's did the same a second later. The candles gutted out simultaneously, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. James dropped to a crouch, his finger moving to his trigger, his training taking over. Sarah, fall back to the entrance, now. He heard Sarah moving, heard the scrape of boots on stone. He stayed low, his weapon sweeping the darkness where Rachel had been standing. His backup light was on his tactical vest, but in the seconds it took to reach for it, he heard breathing close by, too close, moving past him with unnatural silence. The light clicked on, and Rachel was gone. The chamber was empty except for the candles, now extinguished, their wax still warm. No exits visible, except the tunnel they'd entered through. James, Sarah called from behind him. I've got movement. He spun, his light catching a figure in the tunnel mouth. Not Rachel. Younger, thinner, wearing what looked like homemade clothing sewn from animal hides. Her face was concealed by a mask made from bone and feathers, but James could see her eyes, intelligent and watching. Emma, he said, raising his weapon. Emma Morrison, I need you to remove the mask and show me your hands. The figure tilted her head, studying him, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. When she spoke, her voice was young, educated, utterly calm. You don't understand what you've walked into, Detective. This isn't an arrest. This is an invitation. My mother let you find us because the mountain requires new blood, new perspectives. You and Detective Reeves have been evaluated. You've been deemed worthy of consideration. Step away from the entrance, James ordered, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years in law enforcement. Do it now. Emma didn't move. Behind her, James saw more figures materializing from the shadows. 3, 4, possibly 5 people, all wearing similar masks, all standing perfectly still. The collective grows, Emma said. Some come willingly, others require persuasion. The mountain is patient. It will teach you what it taught us, that the self is an illusion, that suffering is transformation, that death is merely a doorway to greater becoming. Sarah's weapon joined James's, both lights trained on the masked figures. Emma, you were 14 when your family disappeared. You're a victim here. Whatever your mother convinced you to believe, whatever you've done, there's still a chance for you to come back, to get help, to heal. Heal from what? Emma's voice carried genuine curiosity. From freedom? From purpose? From understanding my place in something eternal? You offer me what, Detective Reeves? Therapy? Medication? A return to the grinding, meaningless existence you call civilization? I was 14 when I escaped that prison. I'm 30 now, and I've lived more authentically in these 16 years than most people do in their entire artificial lives. The figures behind her moved closer, tightening the circle. James did the calculation instinctively. 6 targets, 2 officers, narrow space, unknown weapons. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. His radio crackled with static. Too deep in the cave system for clear communication, but backup was coming. They just had to hold position, maintain standoff, prevent escalation. "I'm not leaving without you," James said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Both of you, Rachel and Emma Morrison, you're coming out of this cave, getting evaluated, getting help. This ends today." Emma laughed, the sound eerily similar to her mother's. "Oh, Detective, this doesn't end. This is just beginning." She pulled the mask off, revealing a face that was both young and ancient, beautiful and terrible. Emma Morrison looked nothing like the 14-year-old girl in the photographs. She looked like someone who had survived impossible things, who had broken and reformed into something entirely new. "My mother is already gone," Emma said softly. "Deeper into the mountain, to the sacred places you'll never find. She's finished her work here. But I remain because someone needs to teach you what the mountain has taught us. Someone needs to show you that your world, with its rules and hierarchies and desperate fear of death, is the real delusion." "Emma," Sarah said, her voice gentler, "I read your diary. I know you understood what was happening to your family. I know you recognized the mental illness, the delusions. That girl, that 14-year-old who wrote those entries, she's still in there somewhere. Let her speak." For a moment, something passed across Emma's face. Uncertainty, perhaps. Memory. The ghost of the girl she'd been. But then it was gone, replaced by that unnerving calm. "That girl died with my brother," Emma said. "What I am now is what she became when she stopped fighting what was real and started accepting it. The mountain doesn't lie, detectives. People lie. Civilization lies. But the mountain shows truth, even when that truth is terrifying." The figures behind her raised their hands in unison, a gesture that might have been greeting, or threat, or prayer. James's finger tightened on the trigger, training warring with the knowledge that these were victims, that opening fire would make him complicit in whatever tragedy had unfolded here. The decision was taken from him by the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoing from the tunnel behind Emma. Backup had arrived. Tactical units with better weapons, better lights, better training for exactly this situation. Emma heard them too. She smiled, sad and knowing. "Another time, Detective Holbrook. The mountain is patient. It will wait for you to understand. And when you're ready, when the weight of your false world becomes too heavy, we'll be here. We're always here." She moved like water, slipping between the figures behind her, disappearing into a crack in the cave wall that James's light hadn't detected. The other masked figures followed, melting into darkness with impossible speed and silence. By the time the tactical team reached them, the chamber was empty, except for James, Sarah, and the gutted candles, still warm with recent flame. The tactical team swept the cave system for 6 hours, mapping passages that extended miles into the mountain, discovering 3 more chambers containing evidence of long-term habitation. But Rachel and Emma Morrison, along with whoever else comprised their collective, had vanished as completely as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. James stood in the incident command tent 3 days later, studying the evidence wall that had grown to consume every available surface. Photographs of the temple chamber, the preserved bodies, the ritual arrangements. timelines tracking the Morrison family's psychological deterioration, maps showing the vast network of caves and passages that honeycombed the Cascade Range. Thomas Morrison sat across from him, gray-faced and trembling, holding a letter that had been delivered to the command center that morning. It had appeared on the windshield of a supply truck, left sometime during the night. Despite the perimeter guards and security cameras, no one had seen who placed it there. "Read it to me again," James said, though he'd already memorized every word. Thomas's voice shook as he read. "Uncle Thomas, I'm writing this because you deserve to know the truth, not the story the police will tell you. Dad didn't die scared or suffering. He found something in the mountains, something that gave him peace after years of depression and darkness. Mom helped him hold on to that peace, even after his body failed. Lucas chose to follow Dad. I chose to stay with Mom. And my daughter Sarah, she was born into this world and never knew the poison of the other one. We're not victims. We're not broken. We're free in ways you'll never understand, because you're still trapped in the prison you call civilization. Stop looking for us. We don't want to be found. But know this, the mountain is patient. It waits for everyone eventually. And when your time comes, when the false world falls away, and you see what's real, we'll be here. We've always been here. With love that transcends your understanding, Emma." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of equipment and distant voices of searchers still combing the mountains. James had read dozens of letters from cult members over his career, recognized the patterns of indoctrination and controlled language. But something about Emma's words carried a conviction that disturbed him more than typical cult rhetoric. "She believes it," Thomas said quietly. "Every word. My niece actually believes that David found some kind of enlightenment out there, that Rachel was helping rather than destroying their family. How does that happen? How does a smart, educated girl become this?" Dr. Winters entered the tent, carrying her laptop, her expression grave. "I've finished analyzing all the journal entries and diary pages. Detective Thomas, I need to show you something that changes our understanding of the timeline." She opened the laptop, pulling up scanned images of journal pages. These entries, attributed to David, written after his death. They're not just Rachel imitating his voice. Look at the handwriting analysis. 3 distinct hands contributed to David's entries after March 2009. Rachel's, Emma's, and a third person we haven't identified. James leaned closer, studying the variations in pen pressure, letter formation, and spacing. "The walker." "Possibly," Dr. Winters confirmed. "But here's what's more disturbing. I've been cross-referencing the philosophical content of the later entries with known literature on wilderness mysticism, survivalist ideology, and cult belief systems. The entries show increasing sophistication, references to texts that neither Rachel nor Emma would have had access to. Someone was educating them, providing intellectual framework for their delusions." She pulled up another document. "I've also been researching missing persons in the Pacific Northwest with survivalist or anti-government ideologies. In 2007, a man named Marcus Venn disappeared from a compound in eastern Washington after a federal raid on an extremist group. He was never found, but witnesses described him as charismatic, highly intelligent, and completely committed to rejecting modern society. Detective, I think Marcus Venn is the walker. I think he found the Morrison family in 2009, saw an opportunity to build exactly the kind of isolated community he'd always wanted, and spent the next 15 years shaping them into his vision." Thomas looked up sharply. "You're saying my brother's family was recruited by some kind of extremist? That this wasn't just mental illness, it was manipulation?" I'm saying it was both, Dr. Winters replied. David's depression made him vulnerable. Rachel's desperation to help him made her vulnerable. Emma's youth and isolation made her vulnerable. And Marcus Venn, if I'm right about his identity, was skilled at exploiting vulnerability. The Morrison family's tragedy became his opportunity. James felt the case shifting again, becoming something darker and more intentional. We need to pull everything we have on Marcus Venn. Associates, family, known skills, and training. If he's been out there for 17 years, building a following, recruiting people like Jennifer Hayworth and Thomas Whitfield, then we're not dealing with a family tragedy anymore. We're dealing with a dangerous organization. The tent flap opened, and Sarah entered, her face flushed with cold and exertion. James, we've got something. A hiker called in a report from 15 miles north of here. He found a message carved into a tree. It's addressed to you. They reached the location by helicopter an hour later, landing in a small clearing where the hiker, a retired schoolteacher named Gordon Mills, waited with 2 park rangers. Gordon led them to a massive Douglas fir at the clearing's edge, its trunk bearing fresh carvings that stood out pale against the dark bark. The message was simple, written in letters 8 inches tall. Detective Holbrook, the mountain remembers those who seek. 8 paths converge at the center. Find the center, find the truth. October 31st. Midnight, come alone. It's a trap, Sarah said immediately. Obviously a trap. James studied the carving, running his fingers over the letters. The cuts were deep, made with a large knife, probably within the past 24 hours, based on the sap still visible in the grooves. It's also the only way we're going to find them. They're offering a meeting, a chance to end this without more people dying. Or a chance to make you disappear like the others, Sarah countered. James, we've identified at least 6 people who went into those woods looking for answers and never came back. You can't seriously be considering this. But James was considering it. October 31st was 4 days away. 4 days to prepare, to position backup teams, to wear a wire, and tracking devices to set up the kind of tactical support that would allow him to accept this invitation while minimizing risk. 4 days to potentially end a case that had consumed 16 years and claimed multiple lives. I'm not going alone, he said finally. Despite what the message says, I'm going with full tactical support. Thermal imaging, aerial surveillance, armed response teams in position. We treat this as a hostage rescue operation, because that's what Emma Morrison is, even if she doesn't recognize it. A hostage. Thomas had insisted on coming to see the message, and now he stood close to the tree, his hand pressed against the bark, as if he could feel some connection to his missing family through the wood. They're giving you a chance to understand. Maybe that's all they want, for someone to truly hear what they're saying, instead of just trying to fix them. They've murdered people, James said, his voice harder than he intended. Jennifer Hayworth and her son. Possibly Thomas Whitfield and Michael Brennan. They've kept Emma captive in the wilderness for 16 years. Understanding isn't the goal here. Justice is. Is it? Thomas turned to face him, tears streaming down his weathered face. Or is justice just another word for forcing them back into a world that failed them? David was sick, Detective. The medical system failed him. Rachel was desperate, and the healthcare system failed her. They were alone and scared and trying to survive. And yes, terrible things happened. But at what point does punishment become more cruelty, heaped on people who've already suffered beyond imagination? The question hung in the mountain air, unanswerable and heavy. James had built his career on clear lines between right and wrong, victim and perpetrator, justice and chaos. But the Morrison case blurred all those lines, left him standing in moral territory he didn't have maps for. The helicopter ride back to command was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. James watched the mountains pass below, their peaks already dusted with early snow, their valleys dark with shadow. Somewhere down there, Rachel and Emma Morrison lived according to rules that made sense only to them, in a world they had built from loss and madness and desperate need for meaning. And in 4 days, James would walk into that world, would stand at whatever center their message referred to, and would try to bring them back to civilization, or die trying, because that was the oath he'd taken, the promise implicit in his badge, to protect and serve, even when protection looked like persecution to those being protected, even when service meant disrupting the only peace people had managed to find in their broken lives. The command tent felt too small when they returned, too full of evidence and theories, and the weight of decisions that would haunt everyone involved, regardless of how they turned out. James stood before the evidence wall one more time, studying Emma's most recent photograph, the 14-year-old girl smiling at the camera, with her whole life ahead of her. That girl was gone now, transformed into something else by 16 years in the wilderness. The question that kept James awake as planning began for the October 31st operation was simple and terrible. Was bringing her back an act of rescue or an act of cruelty? And how could anyone possibly know the difference? October 31st arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. James stood at the designated coordinates at 11:45 p.m., surrounded by tactical teams positioned at 300-yard intervals, helicopter support, maintaining thermal oversight, every technological advantage the sheriff's office could marshal, deployed in support of one detective, walking into darkness. The clearing was small, surrounded by old-growth forest, lit only by starlight and the thin beam of James's flashlight. At precisely midnight, figures emerged from the trees, 7 of them, all wearing the bone and feather masks, moving in perfect synchronization to form a circle with James at its center. The tallest figure removed his mask, revealing a man in his 60s with gray hair and piercing blue eyes that reflected James's light like an animal's. "Detective Holbrook, I'm Marcus Van. I believe you've been looking for me." Marcus Van is wanted for questioning in connection with multiple missing persons cases, James said, his hand resting on his weapon. "I'm placing you under arrest." Marcus smiled, sad and knowing. "You're welcome to try. But first, since you came all this way, perhaps you'd like to understand what you've been chasing, what the Morrison family found that was worth giving up everything for." "They didn't give up anything," James said. "It was taken from them. By you. By this." He gestured at the masked figures. "You exploited David Morrison's mental illness, manipulated Rachel's desperation, and trapped Emma in your twisted fantasy. I provided shelter when they were dying in the woods," Marcus corrected gently. "I shared knowledge when they were confused and afraid. I helped them transform tragedy into transcendence. Everything they became, detective, they chose, just as everyone here chose." One by one, the other masked figures removed their coverings. James's breath caught as he recognized faces from missing persons files. Michael Brennan, alive, his eyes clear and calm. A woman who matched the description of a hiker, reported missing in 2018. And Emma Morrison, standing directly across from him, her expression unreadable. "You see," Marcus continued, "we're not victims. We're not prisoners. We're people who looked at civilization, at its violence and greed and desperate grasping, and we chose something different. The mountain doesn't demand much, just honesty, just surrender of the false self, just acceptance of death as transformation rather than ending. And the people who didn't survive that transformation, James demanded. Jennifer Hayworth and her son, Thomas Whitfield, how do you justify their deaths? Marcus's expression didn't change. Some people can't let go of the world they came from. They cling to fear, to old identities, to the illusion of safety that civilization promises but never delivers. We tried to teach them. The mountain tried to teach them. They rejected the teaching. What happened after that was their choice, not ours. That's murder dressed up in philosophy, James said, his anger rising. You're a cult leader who's convinced vulnerable people to abandon their lives and die in the woods when they don't comply with your insanity. And you're a law enforcement officer who's convinced that your way of life is the only valid one, Marcus countered. That anyone who rejects your rules must be saved from themselves. Tell me, detective, in your years of service, how many people have you returned to civilization who were actually happier for it? How many lives have you genuinely improved by forcing people back into the system that broke them in the first place? James had no answer. Behind him, he could hear his tactical teams closing in, responding to the multiple targets, preparing for extraction. But Emma stepped forward before anyone could move, pulling something from beneath her clothing. A small photograph, worn and faded. "This is my daughter, Sarah," she said quietly. "She was born here. She lived here. She died here at age 7, from a fall while exploring a canyon. It was an accident, a tragedy. But, detective, she lived those 7 years more fully than most children live their entire lives. She knew her family. She knew the forest. She knew peace. I grieve her every day, but I don't regret the life she had." "Emma," James said, his voice gentler than before, "you were 14. You're a victim here, regardless of what you've been taught to believe. Come back with me. Get proper therapy. Process what happened to your family. Give yourself a chance at a real life." "This is my real life," Emma replied. "Everything else, that was the dream. A nightmare of school shootings and climate catastrophe and people dying alone in hospitals. Here, we live deliberately. We die deliberately. We honor both. That's not insanity, detective. That's clarity." The tactical teams burst from the trees, weapons raised, shouting commands. Marcus and the others didn't resist as handcuffs were applied, as they were separated and searched and read their rights. Through it all, they remained calm, almost serene, as if arrest was just another experience to be observed rather than feared. Emma was the last to be cuffed. As the officer led her away, she looked back at James one final time. "You'll think about this conversation for the rest of your life, detective. You'll wonder if we were the crazy ones, or if maybe, just maybe, we saw something true that you're not ready to accept. The mountain is patient. It will wait for you." The processing took weeks. Marcus Venn was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, reckless endangerment, and being an accessory to manslaughter. The others, including Emma Morrison, underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation. The remains found in the cave temple were identified and returned to families who had spent years searching for answers. Rachel Morrison was never found. Search teams combed the mountains for 3 months before the winter snows made it impossible to continue. She remained somewhere in that wilderness, living according to her own fractured logic, alone now, but still believing, still performing whatever rituals she thought necessary to honor the dead and commune with the mountain. James retired 6 months after the arrests, unable to shake the questions Emma had planted in his mind. He found himself hiking more, spending time in the mountains, seeking something he couldn't name. He told himself it was therapy, processing trauma, finding peace after a difficult case. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when the wind moved through the trees and the light fell at certain angles, James wondered if he was searching for something else. Understanding, perhaps, or proof that civilization was worth defending. Or maybe, in his darkest moments, he wondered if Emma had been right, if the world he'd devoted his life to protecting was simply a shared delusion that most people were too afraid to question. The Morrison case remained open, files accessible to any investigator curious about what happened to one family that walked into the mountains in 2008 and emerged as something entirely different. It stood as a warning about the fragility of sanity, the power of isolation, and the human mind's capacity to construct meaning from chaos, even when that meaning led to tragedy. But it also stood, though few would admit it, as a question, a challenge to certainty, a reminder that the line between madness and enlightenment, between victim and chooser, between tragedy and transformation, was far thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And somewhere in the Cascade Range, in caves and clearings that appeared on no maps, the mountain kept its secrets, patient and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human attempts to impose meaning on its vast, uncaring presence. The Morrison family had walked into that mountain 16 years ago. Some of them never left. Some of them came back changed. And some of them, James suspected, were still there, watching, waiting, living according to truths that civilization had no language to describe. The mountain remembers those who seek. Emma's final words to him, spoken as she was led away in handcuffs, haunted him most of all. "You found us, detective. But the real question is, what did you find? And can you live with the answer?" James still didn't know. He suspected he never would.